Okay, so welcome back. Very glad to see you again. So Saturday, I finished the lecture on this slide, whereby I'm starting to move closer, I would say, to the frontier in this literature on, that is using micro-level data to tackle trade issues. So the point I was making when discussing this slide is that most of the literature following Mejean has been using this assumption that firms, even though they are potentially quite heterogeneous in terms of their productivity, they still behave as under monopolistic competition, so they don't really internalize the fact that their productivity give them some kind of market power. So, and this is again a problem because what we see in the data is that the distribution of firm size is extremely flat-tailed, and thus there are very big players in the market that we should expect might have a bit of market power, as is now extensively discussed in the macro literature. Okay, so I already told you a bit about the way the theory has kind of integrated this notion that some firms might have some form of granularity, might have more impact on the overall market than others. So let's just look at who are those firms in the data. So again, I want to always stay very close to the data. So this is an illustration of the role of these very big firms that I'm going to keep on calling the happy few, based on the original name that was given to those firms by Thierry Meyer and Gianmarco Ottaviano, I think. Now, a lot of people are referring to those firms as superstars, but basically we are talking about a very small number of firms that are very big. So just to give you an idea of how big, how little, so this is based on French data. I told you I'm going to work a lot with those data. So here I'm working with the near universe of French firms. And in my sample, I have about 1 million such firms. And then I'm just restricting this sample to firms that are globally engaged, which by my definition and others, mean a firm that can be globally engaged through importing or exporting. And among those globally engaged firms are another type of firms, which are those that are part to multinational firms. So either French affiliates of foreign multinationals or French firms that have affiliates abroad. So these four non-mutually exclusive categories are described here. What you see in this table is that among the 1 million firms that constitute my universe of French firms, there are about 20% of firms that either import and or export. So this is something I already told you about yesterday. What you have on top of this information that I already discussed is how much they account for the production of aggregate value added in France. So among the 1 million firms, these 20% of firms that import, export represent about 70% of aggregate value added. And thus, as you can see, they are larger than the average. Then you go to this even smaller subsample of firms that are part of a multinational. And then again, this number goes down. There are about 30,000 affiliates of foreign multinationals in France, and less than 2,000 French firms that have foreign affiliates. But as you can see, again, these firms, even though there are very few of those, account for a large chunk of aggregate value added. So these are those numbers here. So here is the most striking, I think. So less than 2,000 firms in France account for as much as 14% of aggregate value added. So obviously this firm might be especially interesting when you think in particular about how these firms are going to affect aggregate outcomes. So it's not exactly this. So they account for, I would say, roughly, so yeah, so this would be something like 30–40% of aggregate trade flows. I don't have the exact numbers here in this. No, it's more in aggregate trade than it is in aggregate value added, because in aggregate value added, you have very large firms like retailers and stuff like this that do not necessarily export a lot, even though some retailers export a lot. Think of Decathlon in France, not to name any firm. But more generally speaking, those the happy few account for an even larger share of aggregate trade. And one reason why, I mean, there are many reasons why we might care about those large firms, but remember on Saturday, I talked a lot about how trade economists think of the cross-sectional dispersion of trade flows. So why is it that we export more to some countries than others? And what you can see from these graphs is that understanding what happened at the very top of the distribution might also be important to understand this cross-sectional variance. So here, more specifically, what I've shown is on the x-axis, the value of exports from France to a particular country, so bilateral trade, that before I told you we can explain with gravity and stuff like this. But what you can see from this graph is that this variance is also very much positively correlated with how much the top 1% firms account for aggregate trade. So on the y-axis, you have the cumulated value of trade that is accounted for by the largest 1% exporters divided by overall trade. And as you can see, the share of these superstar firms in aggregate trade is very much positively correlated with the overall value of trade, even though there is a bit of noise with some countries that are a bit like a bit different, like here, this country here. But overall, what we see in the data is that basically, again, digging into those, the participation to trade of these top 1% firms might be very important to understand aggregate outcomes. So I'm not going to enter too much into the details on this, but there has been over the last 10 years, a lot of literature pointing at the role of these happy few firms for a number of aggregate outcomes. I'm just referring here to 4 papers. One I'm going to come back on, which discusses how aggregate trade adjustment explain a lot by what happens at the very top of the distribution. That's one aggregate outcome that you can be interested in. I have previous research looking at how these firms might be especially important to understand how shocks transmit across countries, the idea being that there are very few firms that are globally engaged, but because those firms are very large, whenever they kind of transmit foreign shocks to the domestic economy, this has a large impact on the overall domestic economy. We also looked with colleagues about their impact on the overall volatility of aggregate trade. And this is related to this notion that basically aggregate trade is a source of diversification of risk. But what we see in the data is that because firms tend to be poorly diversified in their trade activities, they tend to export to a small number of countries and small number of partners in each of these countries. They end up being quite exposed to idiosyncratic shocks hitting their partners. And what we argue in this paper, what we show in this paper is that this is true, including at the top of the distribution. So even very large firms that you would expect are exporting everywhere, importing from everywhere, so diversify very well risk, end up quite exposed to idiosyncratic risk. And I guess that since the paper has been published, we've seen this quite strikingly during the COVID pandemic, where we saw a lot of very large firms ending up being quite exposed to country-specific risk related to the evolution of the pandemic and stuff like this. Okay, so this is how large firms affect the aggregate volatility of trade. And finally, there is a very nice paper by Gobert and Itzkowski, which is looking at how these firms might shape comparative advantages, the idea being that the standard way of thinking about comparative advantages rely on some countries being relatively better at producing some particular type of goods. But what Gobert and Itzkowski argue is that perhaps it's not countries that are particularly good at exporting, at producing those goods, but individual firms that by chance might be better. Yes?
Just coming back to the risks that these large firms case of you said, I agree that it's a little bit surprising that they're not better insured against risk. Does this line of work help us understand why they're not better insured?
So this particular paper is very much like about the empirical questions, so just providing some evidence and also providing some evidence that consistent with what you would expect, large firms are better diversified than smaller ones. So what we show is that even if we have this kind of decreasing relationship between exposure to risk and size, the relationship is not strong enough so that in the aggregate, we end up with a structure of trade that is well diversified. So this is mostly an empirical paper, but I mean, there's some attempts, I think now, in particular, since what we've seen during the COVID crisis, which is this whole mess with global value chains, I think that it is fair to say that there are a few people that are not starting to think about risk, in particular in the context of global value chains. So I've seen a few papers. There are people like Ben Golub, for instance, who is working on network that are thinking about it. But I think it's very kind of frontier with respect to the literature in trade, because basically international trade is very much about static model in which firms are kind of risk neutral. And thus this component of risk is very much absent from this type of literature. So there is certainly more work to be done for students that are like perhaps thinking about what to work on regarding the interaction between like the first moment of trade, like how you minimize your costs or maximize your revenues by deciding on whether to import, export, etc., and what it implies in terms of second moments like the volatility of your sales, etc. But again, this is not very standard because it requires to think about risk aversion or some impact of risk in models that are usually like not designed to this type of analysis. Okay, so that's what I wanted to mention about those very large firms. Now I'm going to move to the last part of this lecture. And I told you when I started, the idea was to kind of very rapidly kind of survey the literature from the beginning on the very first papers that have been using firm level data to tackle trade issues, and then go into various dimensions of this data that have or could be exploited to tackle new issues. So let me tell you a bit about those dimensions, again, taking the French example as reference, but what is true for France is true for many other countries. So this paper kind of lists the type of variable that you can get granted access to when you're using firm level data. So up to now, I've mostly talked about basically what you can recover from using the firm identifier, the fact that aggregate trade is actually the sum of trade by individual firms, and the country dimension that tells you where those firms are globally engaged. But what you see from this table is that there are many more variables that can be exploited. So today I'm going to talk a bit more about the product dimension, although I'm not going to enter into much details because this is a literature that is already quite rich. I'm going to talk a bit about the date, basically the timing and the time series that you can recover from information on the particular date of a transaction. And I'll talk about values and quantities, because international trade data kind of systematically display transaction or trade flows in both nominal and real terms, which is something that is very useful if you think of what other firm level data are providing. And finally, I'll talk a lot about the identification of the partner of the firm-to-firm dimension of the data that now people are exploiting, and I'm exploiting in my own work. There are additional data variables that I'm not going to talk about, but there are potentially very interesting information in those. I'm mentioning here the mode of transportation, whether the good is transported by air, boats, etc. Baptiste has worked on this while I was supervising his master. I talked yesterday with one of you about Incoterm. So this is basically information about who's paying for the transportation of the goods from one point to the other, which is an important source of information as well. I haven't really used this variable up to now in my research, but it's potentially useful. Now I know that I've discussed with a colleague of you from Princeton who's starting to use invoicing currencies. So what is the invoicing that is used in trade data, in particular extra EU trade data? And there might be additional that I don't know about. And of course, this is just for France, but other countries are collecting slightly different data. So what I'm saying here is that there are a lot of dimensions that haven't yet been exploited much. So again, come, play, use data. It's really fun. So let me go very quickly on the first two components. The first one is about multi-product, so the product dimension. Which is very detailed in trade data, again, for the very reason that the tax that are collected thanks to this data are defined at a narrow product level. So trade policy is defined at an extremely detailed level. And for this reason, customs declaration includes precise descriptions of what are the type of products that are traded between countries. And this product dimension first help understand what are the type of goods that we are working with, but it also makes it possible to dig into an additional margin of international trade, which is the product margin. I'm going to skip this section because there is already quite a lot of literature on this. We know that there are various ways we can integrate this dimension into standard trade models, or having firms that eventually select into multiple products is something that we kind of know how to model. So just to remind you of the type of graphs we discussed on Saturday. So this is illustrating this product dimension, multi-product dimension, and as you would expect, firms in trade data are quite heterogeneous in terms of the number of products they export, and there is some a tendency of large firms to being more likely to export multiple products. So here I'm not going to enter into the details, but just to keep in mind that these graphs are very much affected by the fact that a lot of international trade is intermediated by trade intermediaries, and those are usually like dealing with many different products. So part of the reason why we have these firms that export more than 100 of products is because some of those are intermediaries that are going to kind of help small firms export indirectly instead of directly. Okay, so let me just keep this. There are very interesting questions. Yes?
I have a question. So you mentioned that the data contains both the price and quantity for traded goods. And does it allow us to do some sort of quality adjustment for the prices?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about this in a minute, if you just wait. So in terms of the product dimension, there are, and there have been a lot of new questions that have been tackled thanks to exploiting this dimension, like how firms adjust their product mix in international markets, or this one, which is a bit newer, and I found very interesting, which is exploiting Indian data to talk about how firms draw by diversifying the type of products that they are selling, and in particular diversifying by across products that share similar inputs. So this is very nice paper, not using actually trade data, but more like product level balance sheet data. But it's, I think, a very interesting paper that I wanted to point out. Okay, but as I said, I don't want to spend too much time. Let me just also quickly go through this question of values and quantities. And this was the question that was just asked. But as I said, the customs usually keep information on both the value and quantity of what is traded. And again, this is related to some tax purposes. Some tariffs are defined ad valorem, others are defined on the quantity of the goods, and thus basically all customs administration record both the value and quantity of the transaction. And this is very useful because once you have values and quantities, you can guess a bit or get a bit of information about the price for those traded goods, which usually is proxied by unit values. And again, so first there are interesting technical issues related to this question of unit values. How good a proxy is it? And I have put a button on this on my slides. And again, once you've tackled this kind of technical issues, you can use this dimension of the data to tackle new questions that I would say now are not so new, but still, this is still a very active literature that is tackling the question of, as was just mentioned, price versus quality differentiation. What makes a firm able to trade? Is it mostly some sort of productivity advantage as initially assumed by Melis, or might there be also some form of vertical differentiation along the quality dimension? So once you have information about what the firm sells in value and quantities, you can say something about the underlying quality of the good, the intuition being that conditional on a specific price, if a firm is able to sell a larger quantity of goods, then it must be that there is some appeal to these products that consumers value, and this is what trade economists would refer to as quality. Okay, so there is a large literature on this. Again, I've put more references at the end of those slides. There is a small literature tackling the question of pricing within the boundaries of the firms, and in particular, all the literature on tax optimization and how firms use transfer pricing to kind of relocate their profits in a tax haven. Paola's colleague, Mathieu Parenti, has worked a lot on these issues. And the last one I wanted to mention is about how firms adjust to shocks in international markets. And in the standard literature, the assumption is a bit like there is a shock affecting, say, relative prices, and thus the trade adjusts mostly through quantities. So given the demand for imports is price elastic, a given international shock or relative price shock is going to induce some reallocation of trade across countries. This is implicitly assuming that there is a full pass-through of those shocks onto prices, but there is a huge literature exploiting this type of variable that shows actually things are a bit more complicated because the level of pass-through of international relative price shocks onto trade prices is far from complete, varies a lot along the productivity distribution, etc., etc. So again, a lot of references here, but I'm going to skip this to tackle issues that I think are a bit less well known from trade economists. Okay, so now I can dig a bit more or spend a bit more time on this dimension that we haven't discussed much up to now, which has to do with the dynamics of trade. And the reason why we haven't discussed this too much is that the vast majority of the trade literature is basically using static models, so thinking about trade in some kind of stationary equilibrium, and shocks to international trade, relative price shocks, leading to shocks to this stationary equilibrium. But as I said before, the trade data are collected at a very narrow level, at the transaction level, so each single transaction is recorded. And the timing, the particular date of this transaction is also recorded in the data. So I don't know how it is in other data, but in France, it's recorded at the monthly level. So firms can basically either like do a custom declaration for each of their transactions, or eventually they can bundle a similar transaction within a month. So the timing that we're the time dimension that we're talking about is at the monthly level, which is already quite high frequency from macro standards. So I'm going to discuss a bit how we can use this kind of time series at the firm level starting with yet another set of difficulties. Again, whenever you're using a new dimension in the data, you're going to face new technical difficulties. The main one in the case of exploiting the time series of this data are those two. So first, international trade is lumpy. Firms do not continuously trade, but very often they are going to bundle, basically, to group together their transaction up to a certain volume and then eventually export once every 2 months or once every 3 months, etc. So this is what Alessandria et al. Called the lumpiness in international trade. And thus this means that, say, you want to start working with monthly firm level trade data, you're going to be facing the huge difficulty that there will be a lot of zeros whenever the firm does not export every single or import every single month. The second difficulty, which is common in the literature on the econometric literature on time series, but I think is even more of a problem in the trade literature, is that there are huge amounts of seasonality in trade data. So let me just illustrate this with this graph, which is showing the intra-annual dynamics of French imports from China between 2000 and 2019. And what I've done is to use like light colors for the earlier dates, and then going to the darkest colors for the most recent years. So what you can see, so everything is normalized at 100 in January. And what you can see from this kind of messy graph is that there is clearly a tendency of French imports from China being relatively low in the early months or in the beginning of the year, so in February, March, and April, and then imports growing throughout the year to reach some form of peak in, say, October and November. And what you can see as well is that there seems to be something a bit systematic about this seasonality, but it's also changing a bit over time. And in particular, what we see is that the peak at the end of the year is kind of seem to become a bit less strong in the most recent period. So of course, there are a lot of things that are going up here, but for instance, you can think of the impact of China changing its specialization of the basket of its exports over time. In the early 2000s, toys were very important in what we were importing from China. And it happens that we parents are mostly purchasing these things around Christmas date. And this has a very strong impact on the volume of what is imported by a country like France. Now there has been an increase in, a shift in the specialization of China. So the type of products that we are importing from China has evolved over time, and perhaps there is a bit less seasonality than there used to be. So of course, this is a very loose way of explaining this, but what I mean here is that when you use the time series, in particular over high frequency data, you always need to keep in mind that seasonality is a very important concern when it comes to trade data. Okay, but this technical difficulties being like discussed, now what can we learn from this additional dimension in the data? Basically, a lot of very important questions related to how trade adjusts to shocks or whatever. So I'm going to illustrate this based on a set of very simple stylized facts that we can recover from the recent period and what happened to trade in the early stages of the COVID-19 crisis. So first, as in many countries, what we saw in the data is that the early stages of the COVID crisis were marked by a very strong decrease in trade and a rebound that has been almost as spectacular as the decrease. So this is illustrated here in this first graph, where you see the year-on-year variation in French exports between January 2020 and December 2020. And as you can see, there has been a very strong decrease in the growth of exports, a very negative export growth that has peaked in March and April 2020. The bars in this graph shows you the margin for adjustment. I told you that a lot of what people are doing with firm level data is to decompose adjustment into intensive, extensive adjustment. So here the dark blue lines are the intensive margin. And as you can see, almost everything in what happened during the early stages of the COVID crisis took place at the intensive margin. So among firms that were exporting and that reduced the volume of their exports. And this graph, which I found very interesting, is digging into even more into this intensive margin by looking at adjustment among different types of firms that are put into bins according to their size. Okay, and here again, you're going to find like relatively small exporters, and when you move right, you go to larger and larger exporters, the happy few we talked about. So the last bar here concerns the top 0.01% of French exporters. So these are something like 20, 30 firms that I'm not going to talk about in detail, but if you know a little bit about France, you kind of know who those firms are. This is not one of my papers. I was a bit surprised that you can actually dig into such granularity without being like having troubles with anonymity, but apparently it's fine. But what you see is that these 0.01% firms, so these 20 firms in France, together they represent almost 20% of aggregate trade prior to the COVID crisis. So, okay, this is a lot. But more importantly, they represent about a third of the adjustment that we've seen during this period. So basically, the trade collapse that we've seen in the early stages of the COVID crisis is to a large extent due to these 20 firms in France that have strongly reduced the volume of their export in the first quarter of 2020. Yeah. So these are people from Banque de France, so apparently it's fine, according to Banque de France, to work at that level of granularity. The second, yeah.
Do we know that these are also the firms that reduced the month before? It could be that they're just cannibalizing whatever. They didn't reduce that much, but now are growing. Everyone else is double.
So they don't provide, I don't remember if the paper has what happened afterwards, but my guess is that basically, yeah, indeed, those firms have reduced very strongly their export during the early stages, but then they have catch up a bit. Of course, we also know what happened to some specific sectors. So say the automobile sector the recovery has been a bit slow, and perhaps within those 20 firms, there might be some car makers. So, but yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, the data are available up to December, and I think now you can probably get access to December 2021. So that would be interesting to see whether this has affected competition in those markets. I don't have the answer.
And they don't look at the import side. It
No.
would be very interesting because of course the firms were shocked on the import
Yeah.
side.
So that's my paper that I'm going to quickly talk about. So that's a kind of complementary paper, also something very descriptive. That's why, I mean, as you know, all economists have had to have their COVID paper. So that's my COVID paper. And so what we did, it was actually a command from the IMF for their research conference. And what they asked us to do is to indeed think of the COVID crisis and how this has affected trade. And the way we tackled this issue was actually to think of the COVID crisis not really as a pandemic, but as a shock to global value chains. And since then, we've seen that these problems have been huge, not necessarily a lot during 2020, but since then, there has been this whole mess in global value chains that I'm sure you've all heard about. But the problem with this general mess in global value chains that we've observed in 2021 and even still now is that basically it is a mess. So it's very difficult to identify where is the mess coming from? So what we decided to do for this paper is to think of the very beginning of the pandemic at a point when it was not a pandemic, but a Chinese disease that has had consequences on global value chains, because China was the very first country to impose a strong lockdown. And I remember like thinking about this question in February 2020 when I was reading about this disease. We were not really like concerned that it could become a pandemic, but I thought of this as a very potentially interesting example of how a shock in one country can transmit across countries through global value chains, because we know global value chains are making production interdependent across countries, and thus whenever there is a shock somewhere, this will have consequences through the propagation along global value chains. So what we did is really to think about what happened in January 2020, which was like China imposing a strong lockdown in particular the Hubei region, and thinking about this in terms of a shock to global value chains. Of course, this shock being country specific, it's going to affect only a small subset of firms, which are the firms that import some of their inputs from China. And so what we did is a very simple event study design, whereby we put some firms into a treatment group. These were those firms that prior to January 2020 were importing some of their inputs from China. And then we have a very natural control group, which are firms that also import some of their inputs, but not from China by chance. And then we can compare the dynamics of their imports and exports before and after the Chinese lockdown. So this is for exports. So for imports, we see something a bit similar, but with the shock having an impact a bit earlier. But for exports, the idea was to say, okay, we have this kind of cute way of identifying a shock to global value chain. How is this shock going to propagate along those global value chains? And in order to tackle this, because in general, we don't have good data on global value chains, what we did is to think about firms that import some of their inputs, export some of their output, and call these firms firms in global value chains. So the transmission is measured by the behavior of their exports. So how much the shock is going to propagate downward the firm. And this is what we see here in red. So this is, I mean, I guess you've all seen even study graph such like this. So we have a shock that takes place around January 2020. And then we look at how treated firms reduce their exports in comparison with control firms. And you see a very strong impact that peaks in April 2020, and then there is a kind of recovery. The blue line is just to show you kind of a placebo, the same exercise 1 year before. And as you can see, the behavior is very different, although we have a slightly significant coefficient here. Why do we have this? Again, because there is a lot of seasonality in trade data. This seasonality is very country specific, and thus potentially like the treatment and control group is made of firms that are not exposed to the same seasonality. And then the question that, and then I'll move on to something else, but the question that everybody talked about since then is why do we see such strong degree of propagation of shocks along global value chains? Why is it that those firms are not well insured? So, and the two main suspects that have been discussed extensively are, first, those firms tend to be little diversified across countries. Global value chains need to diversify so that there is some buffer whenever a country is hit by a shock or a firm is hit by a shock. If you have multiple providers for these inputs, potentially you have, having two suppliers for each input is enough to already like buy you a lot of diversification and insurance. In the paper, we test this story, but do not really find expected results. So basically what we show is that the firms that ex ante were better diversified, as far as we can measure this diversification. So those firms that were importing their inputs from both China and another country did not perform better than those that were fully exposed to China. And we discuss into more details. If you are interested, you can look at the paper. We discuss a bit more why it is the case, but basically that's the kind of very simple result that we observe. The second, so what we show with, so first there is a big problem, which is that diversification is very difficult to measure at that level. So what we did is to consider that whenever an input, a particular product is imported from China and another country, the firm is diversified, but it may well be the case that these inputs are differentiated. These are two varieties of the same input, and thus it's not clear that those are substitutable. And the second thing, so that's a measurement issue. Exactly. That might well be a measurement problem. The second thing that we found that was very surprising to us is that among the firms that were non-diversified ex ante, we find a significantly stronger likelihood of those firms finding new partners immediately after the shock. So basically what we estimate is the probability that those firms start importing the same input from a new country in February, March, and April. And we find very strong evidence that those that ex ante were not diversified are more likely to start importing from another country ex post, which, if you think about the trade literature, is very surprising. And I'm going to talk about this a lot afterwards, because we think of those global value chains as being extremely persistent, displaying a lot of stickiness, which we believe, and I believe, is due to the fact that there are a lot of frictions for firms whenever they're starting a relationship with a supplier. And this form of stickiness, these frictions, make it very unlikely that the firm is going to adjust to a shock by finding new partners. You know, research is full of surprises. So in the specific case of the COVID crisis, we do see some of this. So we do see some of the firms that were the most exposed ex ante finding new partners ex post, which doesn't mean that there is perfect substitution. Otherwise, we would not have this very strong decrease in relative export. So it's still true that there has been a transmission of the shock. So there must be that these firms did not fully manage to absorb the shock. But still, there is some evidence that firms find new partners in the context of a very important crisis, which I think is interesting. So we do this very simple. So we look at imports 6 months prior to January 2020. And first, like, take all importers of intermediaries and put them into two groups. Either you import at least one of your input from China or you're not. And then in the paper, we do a lot of robustness because, of course, this group might be very heterogeneous. So at the end, we also do some propensity score matching across those firms to try to find a control group that is as good as possible. We do a lot of robustness with respect to this, but here it's really as simple as I just said. So whenever you're importing some of your input from China, you're exposed. Whenever you do not, you're controlled.
I was thinking the graph before, where we see the difference in the inventories.
The one, yeah.
And I see that the shock is stronger for those with low inventories. But shouldn't we also expect that it would happen, you know, like more recently than the one with high inventory?
Yeah, so I mean, so let me first say what is in this graph, and then we can discuss a bit what we can conclude and where we don't want to push too much the interpretation, because I think more work needs to be done on this. But I was saying a lot of the discussion about those supply chain disruption has been about diversification of those supply chains. The second thing that has been discussed extensively is that the structure of those global value chains display a lot of just-in-time production. Firms have reduced at the maximum their inventories so that they can adjust production and minimize cost. So part of the reason why you can have very strong propagation and diffusion of shocks along those global value chains is that basically there are no buffers. So we took this interpretation seriously, and what we did, I told you something nice that you can do with firm level data is merge with balance sheet data. So we did this, we took balance sheet data for 2018, so way before the pandemic, 2018, because at the time we did not have more recent balance sheet data. So we matched the firms with their account from 2 years before. And then we look at the level of inventories, which is a variable that you find in balance sheet data, and put our treated firms into two groups, those that on average tend to have high level of inventories in comparison with other firms in their sector, and those that display low inventories. So these high and low inventories, you should not think in terms of being having high or low inventories at the moment when the shock hit, and we don't observe inventories at a sufficiently high frequency. But we think of this measure as being saying something about how these firms, the technology of these firms, and how much on average they invest into inventories. And what we find that, I'm going to take the question, what we find is that the relative trade adjustment that I talked about before is entirely driven by the subsample of firms that we see with low inventories in 2018, which is consistent with what we would expect. So the firms that on average have inventories had buffer at the moment when the shock hit. The other firms did not, and thus there is a stronger transmission for those shocks that had inventories and those that had not. Of course, we're talking here about a shock that took place in January 2020, but then there has been 2 years of a mess. So this doesn't mean that afterwards those firms have performed better, but at least it shows that potentially inventories can be an interesting variable to exploit in order to think about those questions.
I was just thinking, do you control some for sector composition? What would be your
so regarding inventories, we always measure this within a sector because, of course, if you're producing food products, you have low level of inventories, and so this we control for. And then we did the same exercise sector by sector with a lot of heterogeneity. But, yeah.
About sectors, about the stickiness of global variations, do you make some sectoral differences of the adjustment?
So I'm going to go there exactly in the next slide. So thank you for the question, but I'm going to postpone. Yeah, so.
It's just surprising that the period is back before we quantify when you have considered incentivizing by changing China to other interpretation.
So most of what we see, I think, is not like firms reshaping their value chain. What we see is like for a few months, and that's, I mean, let me just show this. So this is the decomposition of the overall effect into the intensive and the extensive margin. So what we see is mostly that during a few months, those firms that were exposed stopped serving some of their destinations that they were serving before, and then they went back to normal, okay? And in principle, this type of graph do not say much about what happened in level because these are difference in difference. So it might well be that everybody afterwards is hit by the shock, and then the collapse is gaining the control group. Apparently, it's not what happened, and you can see why from the overall behavior of aggregate trade. It's basically that there has been a very strong recovery. And it seems to be consistent with what we find here. So I don't think that from this, I understand very well what happened, because indeed, it's a bit surprising that you have such a sharp decrease and then a very strong recovery. Of course, it's a bit of a complicated event because at the time when we are talking about the largest effect, there is a lockdown in France, so both treated and controlled firms no longer care about their input purchases. It's just a mess everywhere. And this is where it becomes very difficult to really say something about the propagation. But the fact that we do see some adjustment already in March, so the lockdown in France was started on the 23rd, I think, of March. And on the import side, what is very nice, and I'll stop with this because otherwise I'm going to keep on talking about this paper and I want to keep time for the rest. But something that we do in the paper is to look at what happened to imports. And on the import side, we see a significant decrease already in February 2020. But what we can do is to dig even more into the data and look at the firms in depending on whether they're importing from China through air freight or through boats. And the reason why you want to look at this is because it takes around 30 days to ship goods from China to France. And what we see that is exactly what we would expect is that imports collapsed in February, but it's mostly driven by those farms that ex ante were importing through air freight, because those have been hit very fast. The lockdown in China started on the 23rd, so I already said 23rd from France, but I think the Chinese one was on the 23rd of January, so immediately production has collapsed, but the impact on trade is going to materialize in the data with some delay, because part of what is imported in February from China in France has been shipped at the end of December or beginning of January. So there is a bit of technical difficulties whenever you're using the time series of data, and you need to take into account the fact that when we see the data imported, that potentially have been exported 1 month before and eventually produced even more before. But what we see in the data is very consistent with the story that there has been a shock to production in China, and this has had consequences on those farms that were exposed to the shock. So let me start with this paper. It's a very simple descriptive exercise. I don't think that the question is closed yet. Perhaps I will have a second COVID paper one day, but this would be when more data are available. Nowadays, now we are trying to get access to very good data on import prices. There are very good data in France, and this data can potentially be very interesting to look at shocks to global value chains and then how they affect inflation and stuff like this. I think there is a lot to be done on that front. And if you're fast enough, perhaps you can write the COVID paper in question before me. But I mean, there are a lot more, and the theory side of it, as I was mentioning before, is very open. I think much more can be done in order to understand this question of disruption, insurance, diversification, etc., within trade models. So let me stop this and use my last 1 hour. I have another hour. So at what time? No, 40 minutes, 35 minutes. Okay, I'll be fine. I'll be on time. Be sure you'll have your coffee before Paola's lecture. So let me discuss the last part, which has to do with this additional margin of international trade that you've heard about. At least I've already talked a little bit about what we see in the data regarding this margin, which is what we call the buyer margin of international trade, that is exploiting the fact that in the data, for some countries, we not only have information at the firm level, but also at the firm-to-firm level. So in particular, in the context of France, it's very constrained. We have this information only for firm-to-firm trade within the European Union on the export side. So for France, I have all the information about the firms that French firms are exporting to within the European Union. And as I said last time, we do have this information for trading goods and trading services. What I'm going to talk about today is only for trading goods, but there are a lot of more data to be exploited on that front. So because we have this additional margin of trade, the first thing we did is to kind of document this additional margin. And guess what? We discovered that it's very heterogeneous across firm. It's very much correlated with size, etc. So this has led to slightly more recent literature digging into the cross-sectional structure of trade networks. So I must say, even though I've done this, it's a bit boring because it's about another margin of trade that we are going to illustrate based on the same CDFs and stuff like that. The only thing that might seem a bit more interesting about this dimension of trade is that it also forces you to think of trade in a bit of a different way. And in particular, think of this in terms of a bipartite graph, whereby you have exporters on one side, importers on the other side, eventually exporters being also importers of another bipartite graph. But say you only see like what I see, French exporters, European importers, and then you see all the transactions that link those two population of firms. And this gives you a graph which properties we can analyze. So the properties of this graph are summarized here. So what we see, generally speaking, is that the graph is extremely sparse. So there are very few transactions linked between nodes in this graph. And those are not a random sample. They are correlated with various variables that we use to characterize these firms. So to quickly summarize what has been done and learned from the analysis of the cross-sectional structure of these trade networks, there are mostly two ways you can explain the structure of the graphs. One involves building models whereby you have some sort of assortative matching between heterogeneous exporters, heterogeneous importers. Then say there are some fixed costs involved into forming a new relationship. And then in equilibrium, you're going to have a form of assortative matching linking the firms on one side with their partner on the other side. So this is basically what is done in this Bernard et al. Two-way, no, I don't remember the title, but the Bernard et al. Paper. The other way, which I'm going to discuss a bit more, is one that introduces random search, explaining the matching of buyers and sellers in international markets. Yes?
I just want to make sure I understand what you mean by assortative matching in this context. Is it that high productive sellers are matched with large buyers?
So what happens, it's even, I'm not even sure that what I wrote was correct. So what happened, if I remember well, in the Bernard et al. Paper, is that there is a fixed cost involved in forming a new pair of a new relationship. And so there are more productive exporters and less productive exporters, and there are importers that are larger or smaller, eventually productive, less productive, etc. So there is two-way heterogeneity. And then this two-way heterogeneity is going to fully determine the set of matches that are going to arise in equilibrium. And what happened is actually the opposite. So what happened in Bernard et al. Is that the large firms end up with a larger set of partners. And they end up like, so basically, if you think of this sequentially, they are going to first serve the very large importers. These are the ones that you want to serve. But because they are large, they also can afford serving relatively small importers on the other side. So they have a wider portfolio of partners that is made of more heterogeneity in terms of who those importers are. While instead, if you think of a firm that has poor or relatively low productivity on the export side, this firm can only afford serving the very big importers. And so in equilibrium, they have less partners, so their degree is smaller in the using the vocabulary of the network literature, but also the mean size of their partner is larger. So it's more like it should be perhaps negative assortative matching. Yeah, yeah. But there is the two dimensions: the number of your partners, and then the mean productivity of your partners. So this is one way of doing it. So basically you have an additional dimension of trade that you need to explain. And then you put an additional source of heterogeneity between individuals that are populating your model. And this additional degree of heterogeneity is going to help match this additional dimension of heterogeneity. The other way is to instead assume some additional randomness in the model. And this is what is done in Son et al. Or this paper that I've just published with my PhD student and Julien Martin. And so what we do is to say we have heterogeneous producers, we have homogeneous importers, but so ex ante they are homogeneous, but ex post they end up heterogeneous because they are randomly matched with exporters, and this induces the type of heterogeneity that we see in the data. So both models, I think, have their pros and cons. I'm not going to enter too much into these debates. They both can replicate what we see in the data that I'm going to quickly discuss. And then I'll tell you what we do when we can do additionally with this type of model. So again, you're used to this type of representation of the heterogeneity in the data. So here the heterogeneity that I'm discussing has to do with what we call the out degrees of those exporters that we see in our data, which in practice means the number of partners that they're serving in a particular country. So we can measure this at out degrees in various ways. So here I'm taking the graphs from the recent paper I'm working on with François Fontaine and Julien Martin. But basically what it shows is that, of course, there are many firms that have just one partner in a given country. This is about 70% of the firms, a bit less if you accumulate across products. And on average, but you also see some firms that have many more partners in a given country. And here I should say that the sample excludes wholesaler intermediaries that are affecting a lot this type of statistics. So here I'm really thinking about firms that are exporting directly some products to foreign markets. And what we see is that among the population of French exporters, there are a lot that only serve one partner in a given country. But we also do see a lot of firms that have a large portfolio of clients in their typical export destination. And guess what? This is correlated with size. Larger exporters on average serve more partners. What we can do is to also look at the other side of the network, so the buyers in degrees. How many French partners do European importers that are connected to French firms have in France? And here what we do is to do this either product by product or cumulating things across products. And this dimension, as you can see, is important because when we look at the first graph here, what we see is that almost all importers that we have in our data that we observe interacting with a French firm in France interact with just one firm in France for a particular products that they're sourcing. So in terms of a production function, I would say that those buyers are importing some of their inputs and some of their inputs from France, but at a point in time, there are just one supplier in France for a particular input. Eventually, they can source several inputs from France, and this is why the second CDF is a bit like shifted down. There are more importers that interact with at least two firms in France once you accumulate across products. But what we do in what follows is really to think about this question at the product level. And because of this property of the data, we are going to think of the problem of how firms are matched in the market for intermediates as a problem of many-to-one matching. Firms on the import side are willing to purchase some inputs, and in our model, they are going to search for one input supplier for the good that they're searching for. Okay, so that's the data. Now let me take my last 25 minutes to really think of what I think can be done based on this type of data. And in particular, how you can exploit some moment in the data that has not been much used to my knowledge, which is about the duration of those firm-to-firm relationships. So as I told you, there is already a literature that is explaining the cross-section. Who are the firms that are connected with many buyers? Who are the buyers that are connected with many sellers? So the cross-section, I think we have kind of a view of how to explain this. But again, we have much more data than a simple cross-section. And in particular, we have quite long time series of the interaction of firms within those firm-to-firm relationships. And so what we are trying to argue in the recent research agenda I have with colleagues is that the duration of this firm-to-firm relationship can be a very interesting moment to exploit. Why is it the case that we are interested into this duration? Because there is a very large literature on global value chains that argue that the matching, the formation of those global value chains, which here I'm going to refer to as the matching of firms with their input suppliers along global value chain, is something that involves very sticky relationships. So it's not that you're willing to import some inputs, and so you're going to go to a spot market and purchase this input. If the input is cheaper from China than from France, then you're going to purchase the good in China, and then eventually next month, you're going to switch to another one. Now, what we argue, the way we think of global value chains are like complex production networks that involve very long relationship, eventually contractual frictions, and thus long contract, etc., etc. But if you think about this, I think it's fair to say that the whole literature on global value chains think of this type of stickiness and explain this stickiness by, depending on the papers, some form of search cost. It's complicated to find the proper input supplier for whatever you have in mind, perhaps because there are some customization costs involved into the relationship. There might be some incomplete contract issues related to how you establish the production relationship and the property rights that are involved into this. So there are a lot of theoretical explanation for why this is the case. I think it's fair to say that people, I think, believe that global value chains are kind of characterized by long-run relationship. And anecdotically, we see a lot of this. You probably heard about Apple switching from Intel to producing its chips within the boundary of the firm. And this was kind of a shock for, something big for Intel, because Apple had been sourcing its chips from Intel for years, decades.
This point of view seems, at least in part, to conflict with what maybe you were talking about earlier, where during the pandemic,
that's why,
firms were
exactly.
able to find partners quite quickly.
Exactly. So that's exactly why we found this result very surprising. And I think there is still more to understand this. Potentially, here it's very like a narrative that I have no clue about, but it could be say that the firm-to-firm relationship are still sticky. But eventually, in case of a disruption, you can still go to an alternative and get an input that is more expensive, but that you can get quickly, or I don't know. Again, I don't think that it's well understood why we have this. It might be a very small phenomenon. So I don't know quantitatively how important these switches have been in the context of the COVID, and whether you see this in other contexts. But I think it's very much an open question that you're raising and that we need to understand. But you're right that here I'm going to think about this type of relationship as involving some stickiness and thus quite a cost involved into switching, in particular in the middle of a pandemic. So, but if the cost of a disruption is large enough, even a high cost of switching might be worth it. So it's not clear that just observing switches is inconsistent with what I'm going to talk about.
Also, it may be that the switches happened in the pandemic for products that were not very related.
Exactly. Exactly. So we do have this, we try to dig a bit into this in the paper, and we found results that were consistent with what you would expect. So the switching being a bit stronger for goods that are more homogeneous than for goods that are more differentiated and stuff like this. But again, I think it's cute and interesting, but it's very descriptive results, and I'm not sure we should push this too much. Still, I think it's interesting, so I want to discuss this a bit, but clearly more work is needed to understand this type of adjustment.
Because there has been talk within the political sectors of insulating the value chains, so how much you can survey data confirmed by how many plan B options you have, right? How much untrust is this? I have a long relationship, but I don't trust you, so I have my plan B, plan C, plan D.
So I think we really don't know much about all of this. We have a lot of theories. We have very little data. Now, during the pandemic, a lot of institutions have put surveys. So now we have few surveys. I've read some results from Banque de France about surveys asking first firms whether they have been exposed to supply chain disruption, what they intend to do in order to get better insurance in the future. But even, I think you're right, the policy debates are huge on this. The problem, and I'm a bit involved into policy debates in France, so I'm asked a lot about these questions, but I think we simply don't have much clue. We don't know what is the optimal thing. We don't know whether policies are optimal in this instance, because it's not clear. There are reasons why there might be externalities in this field because you have a network, so network externalities might be very important. But how important, it's not clear. Perhaps we should just like let firms decide and then support the cost. Or I think, yeah, the normative aspect, I think, are even less studied and
Yeah, there is a new growth content, but
exactly.
which looks at the normative
Yeah, on the diversity. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, there is, but I'm not sure the point is settled yet. And in particular, yeah, the dynamic aspect, again, there is one thing which is to be exposed, but then there is, given you are exposed, what is the cost of the disruption, then what is the benefit of having buffers at the time of the disruption? These questions that very much involve the dynamics, I think, are really absent and from the field, the literature, but not at all from the policy circle. So there are a lot of investment that are done now to reshore chips in the US, in the EU. Is it an optimal policy or not? I mean, I have no clue. I'm not going to tackle this question. And whenever I'm asked, I say, I don't know. Okay, so what I was just trying to say is that at least in the theoretical literature, I think it's fair to say that there is this strong view that there are a lot of frictions that make it very difficult for firms to like adjust their supply chain, and thus this might explain why ex ante we see those firms being hardly diversified and having very strongly concentrated supply chains. So what we want to argue in this research agenda that we have is that the reason why we have more theory than data on this topic is that global value chains is really an area of trade whereby we have very poor data, very few data. The best data we have are input-output tables at the international level, but this is extremely aggregated data. So it really goes kind of backward with respect to a lot of literature that is pointing at heterogeneity of trust firms. And the reason why we have so little data is that basically in order to characterize the global value chain, you need firm level data for firms over multiple countries. It's extremely difficult. So I'm not going to pretend we can really like characterize those global value chains, but the way we are going to think about this is that we do have data about some firms that are potentially like some nodes into those global value chains. We have quite good information about their relationship with the next step in the value chain, which are the firm-to-firm data. So can we use the duration of those observed firm-to-firm relationships to say something about the frictions that those firms are facing? So this is one step towards characterizing a bit more those frictions. So just to give you an idea of the type of heterogeneity we have, this is an histogram of the duration of firm-to-firm relationship in our sample. So what you have here are very short relationships, so firms that we see interacting just over just one transaction that would be kind of characterized by very short duration, potentially the purchase of the input on a spot market, etc. So we have a lot of those. But what we see as well is that we have kind of a long tail. And so we do observe a lot of very long relationships. Some of these very long relationships can take place within the firm. This might be intra-firm relationship. Unfortunately, we cannot say whether this is the case, but obviously, if you see a firm interacting again and again over years, it's more likely that this relationship takes place within the firm. So again, the question is, can we learn something from this about the stickiness of trade relationships that might be important to think about global value chains? So I have 15 minutes to present a paper that is kind of heavy. So let me explain how we see this. I won't enter into the analytical details, but we posted the first draft on my website. And of course, I'm very excited about this paper. Perhaps in 1 or 2 years from now, I'll be sick of the paper because I have a hard time publishing it or whatever. But now I'm still very excited about this paper. So send me your questions and I'm more than happy to discuss. So the paper is joint work with a labor economist. And as you will see, the reason why having a labor economist on the team is very, I think, makes a lot of sense in this instance, because what we do is basically to borrow everything from the labor literature and put it into a trade context. Why do we do this? We have bipartite data. You might have done some labor courses. You know that labor economists think a lot about the matching of pools of employees and employers. You just like rename those as exporters and importers, and you end up with the structure of the data that I have. So to say it in a single sentence, our model is Eaton-Kortum meeting Postel-Viner-Robin. So Eaton-Kortum you all know about. Postel-Viner-Robin is the kind of seminal on-the-job search model that the labor economists like to use. So what the model does is to start from a very simple partial equilibrium Ricardian framework. We are going to think about trade in intermediates. So we have final producers that are willing to purchase some inputs, and we take it as given. And the way they decide about who they're purchasing the input from is based on Ricardian comparative advantages. So basically, I'm purchasing from the lowest cost supplier. But I'm going to add some frictions to this so that the firm might not be able to identify who is the lowest cost supplier in the world for this input. And the second thing that I'm going to add is the dynamic aspect that is not yet, I think, in the literature, which is bargaining. So the way bargaining is going to work is exactly as in the labor literature on the job models. So we are going to have final producers that are matched with some input suppliers. And randomly, they are going to receive new offers. So they are going to meet with new input suppliers. And these new input suppliers are going to help the firm extract more surplus from the relationship that they already have. So basically, I'm already like purchasing my product from supplier A, and we've settled on a price. And then I meet with this guy who might be good or not good, but I'm going to use this new offer to renegotiate my price with my existing supplier. If the existing supplier is not willing to decrease the price enough, I'm going to switch. So the relationship is going to end, and I'm going to start a new relationship. But eventually, I can keep on interacting with my former supplier, but I'm going to reduce to be able like negotiate a reduced price. So we are going to develop this model, and I'm going to skip almost all of it because I don't have much time, and I want to talk about data. I told you I'm very much into data, so I'm going to try explain or give you a hint on what moments can be useful to identify those frictions. But basically, we're going to estimate the model structurally using basically the toolbox of those labor economists. And then we study what it implies for trade adjustment, but I'm not going to.
So there is going to be a third friction, not contracting.
No.
Because I thought if you're relating to this duration.
So the duration is going to be, I mean, we are going to have endogenously long and short relationship, but there will be no formal contract. And instead, we are going to even like assume something even stronger. We are going to assume that the firm is able to commit only up to the next transaction for the relationship. And this is going to be a very useful assumption, in particular in comparison with Postel-Viner-Robin, because what you have in the labor literature, if you know a bit about those, the wage that is negotiated in those models is a bit complicated because it has an intertemporal dimension. So basically, you're negotiating a wage, taking into account the fact that in the future, you're going to be able to renegotiate with your current employer. This intertemporal component in the bargaining, we are going to mute by assuming that basically, when I decide to interact with a supplier, I'm not losing my outside option. So in the labor literature, once you've passed a contract with Oxford, you can no longer go back to ULB and say, oh, fine, it was not as good as I thought, and thus I'm going to go back to you, and then we start a new relationship again. In the context of trade in intermediaries, this might be debatable, but what we are going to assume is that you can switch today and eventually recall your past intermediaries. So what this means is that over time, you're going to bring with you the whole stock of suppliers that you've met before. And this is going to help you get more market power over time within and across your relationship. So there will be a dynamic aspect in the market power that final producers will have, and that we will be built on the whole history of the matches that they have had. Okay?
Sounds super interesting, very tractable. And I can see because you're working with the labor economy, the only thing that we are seeing this parallel with the employee. The thing is that in the global supply chain, there will be some tailoring, you know, there's like the suppliers to invest to make the.
No, I think
you get the other thing.
No, I
But
agree.
you wanna-
And I think, I mean, the way I like to think about it, hopefully Francois is still interested in the future to work on those topics, is that much more can be done related to contracts, indeed. And indeed, in the data, you do see, I mean, there are some very weak evidence of contracts that we saw, for instance, by observing that there is in some sectors a bit of bunching in durations. So the probability that a relationship ends is slightly larger after 6 months, 1 year, like things like this, which might be indicative of some markets functioning with predetermined contracts. Here we wanted to have a model that is very tractable, that we can use to estimate soft frictions a bit broadly, but clearly I think much more could be done. We will lack a bit the tractability that we have here. And I also think that digging into these questions that I think are very interesting will force us to think more about what type of products are more likely to be characterized by this type of contracts and stuff like this. So again, I think it's a first step. And what is very nice, I think, with this research agenda is that in a way we already know where we should aim, because there is the whole labor literature that has developed a lot of very fancy theoretical models for thinking about contracts and stuff like this, for also like thinking about what moments in the data can be used. So I think we're basically building on an existing very large literature, and a lot of what we can do can be inspired from this literature. But what I'm going to present today has the very nice feature of tractability, but the downside of this is that indeed we are not capturing a lot of contract. We are basically summarizing the duration as being the outcome of one single source of frictions, which are those such frictions. Okay, so given I have 7 minutes, I'm going to skip almost everything and just like tell you where you should look for details. So this is Eaton and Kortum. You all know about this. And the only thing we have is that instead of like the supplier observing the whole distribution of cost for all potential suppliers in the world and then picking the best option, the buyers and seller are going to meet randomly, and we're going to have this gamma ik, which is a structural parameter that measures the probability that a final producer, which is located in country I, meets with a potential supplier located in country K. And this might be input specific. And we're going to estimate this parameter for individual countries and individual products. The second aspect is the one that potentially you know a bit less about, but it's really like the Postal-Vinet and Robin idea that when you have this type of random search, you can solve the model by assuming there is Bertrand competition among the subset of suppliers that you have met. And as I said before, we're going to assume there is no commitment beyond the current transaction, so that what I'm negotiating today only hold for this transaction, and eventually next period I can renegotiate. So this is kind of very standard. Once you impose this Bertrand competition, you're going to look at the whole set of firms that you've met. You can rank them in terms of the best price they can offer to you. This is this ranking that we have here. And we know that the solution to this problem is to pick the interaction with this best supplier and bargain up to the point of your outside option, which is the second best supplier. So this gives you a very simple rule for prices. And this also gives you some insight about what is going to happen, conditional on my existing network, when I meet with a new potential partner. So over time, I'm going to meet with new partners. These partners are characterized by a cost, C. And then based on this cost based on this input supplier that I've just met, I'm going to be able to negotiate.
Price dispersion decreases.
Exactly. So price dispersion decreases, which is something that we see in the data. So within a firm-to-firm relationship, when we observe the same firms doing several transactions sequentially, what we observe systematically, it's not super nice graph, but what we see in the data a bit systematically is that there is a tendency for prices to be renegotiated down over the length of the relationship. And this is true for short relationship, for long relationship, etc. When we look at price changes across matches, so when a firm switches from one French supplier to the other, what we see instead is the price often goes down, but very often as well, I mean, there is a mass here on positive value. So often the firm switches, but the price increase, which at first initially was kind of a bit of a problem for us, but this is the reason why in the paper we've introduced quality differentiation so that we can explain why you might want to switch to a higher price supplier. Okay. What is nice with this model is that we have a lot of very simple analytical predictions that are going to be useful to then estimate the model. So unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss this, but just believe me, these are like analytical solutions for the distribution of prices in which, I mean, the distribution of cost in which buyers from I pick their suppliers. This is this distribution that we have here, and the ex-post distribution that they're actually discussing their price upon. So these are those two CDF that we can solve for analytically. And the last thing that I wanted to point about is that we have very simple predictions regarding trade shares. So how much inputs are going to be sourced from France is a function of comparative advantages. This is this term here. This is the Eaton cartoon story. Ricardian comparative advantage are going to shape the structure of trade in this type of model. But on top of this, you're going to have a structure of trade that is distorted by such frictions. And the intuition is that, of course, if France is very good at producing some particular inputs on average, it's going to have large trade share. But if it also happens that French firms, for whatever reason, have a very hard time meeting with partner in a particular country, conditional on comparative advantage, it's going to reduce trade shares. And again, we can solve for this analysis. Okay, in my 2 minutes, I'm going to tell you just a bit about the intuition for how we can estimate this type of model and what moments we can explore. So the fact that we have very strong assumption gives us the analytical predictions, and the analytical predictions imply it's relatively easy to estimate the model. And here we are building a lot on Eaton and Fortum. You all know about a lot of insights that they've put into the trade literature. We are basically like borrowing a lot of the tricks from them. The dimensions of the data that will be useful to identify those such frictions are related to what I told you very quickly about, the fact that we observe sequence of transactions for a particular firm importing. So in our case, it's going to be an European importer, and we see all the transactions of this firm with French firms. And this transaction can take place within a relationship, or we can also observe switches, so a firm that at one point in time imports from one French firm and then switches to another supplier. So these are obviously very useful to say something about how easy it is to switch. The frequency of those switches are going to be informative about friction. There was a lot of, a few issues that we need to think about when going from this to the estimate. One that is a bit related to something I briefly talked about is the fact that in the model, you switch, you match, you do a transaction, these actions all take place together. In the data, I told you international trade is very lumpy. The frequency of transaction is very infrequent and heterogeneous across firms. So we need to take into account the fact that you might meet with a supplier and eventually do a transaction later. So we do this by assuming there is an additional randomness in when you're doing a transaction. This is relatively easy. The second problem, which is more important, is that you do observe switch whenever the importer switches from one French seller to another. But of course, this is only a subset of switches. There are many more. And in particular, the buyer might well switch to a non-French supplier. Although I think a higher French suppliers, it's kind of obvious that this will happen very often. So in order to take into account the fact that we don't observe all switches, we're going to have to rely on simulated maximum likelihood for the estimation. And the last thing that is a bit of a problem is that you never really observe. We discussed a lot productivity, heterogeneity, quality, heterogeneity, but unfortunately firms do not tell us whether they're productive or not, qualitative or not. So what we are going to do is to use unconditional inference to take into account the fact that the duration, the relationship may be long because it's a good firm, but we don't know exactly who the good firms are. Okay, let me skip the rest and finish with this graph, which is the outcome of this whole process that took us like 3 years to converge. So after discussing a lot how to identify things based on our data, we ended up with a method which is based on simulated maximum likelihood using unconditional inference. Don't ask me details, but basically Francois was extremely happy when he discovered that we can estimate the model using simulated maximum likelihood using unconditional inference. Apparently, for labor economists, it's the best way you can use your data. I don't know if it is true, but at least it's. I can testify that he was pretty happy with this. Okay, just a glimpse at the results, expecting you to, hopefully you will be interested enough so that you can then look at the paper. But basically from this, what we can estimate are all those parameters, so frictions facing French firms in all of their markets, but also frictions that other competitors are facing and the degree of comparative advantage. So we can basically have everything. Something that I think is interesting is this number. So in the data, we find that about 42% of the heterogeneity in trade shares can be explained by differences in such frictions. Just to give you an idea, obviously in the alternative model that we're building on, which is Eaton and Cortoon, this heterogeneity is entirely explained by comparative advantages. We find that after, if you believe in our estimates, comparative advantage explain a bit more than 50% of the variance, and such frictions explain 42%, which seems to be enough so that we should perhaps dig a bit more into this. Then we have some results. I'm going to skip this. And gravity seems to again be important, which was not completely obvious, but apparently it's easier for French firms to meet with partners in Belgium, Luxembourg, Spain, Germany. So again, perhaps everything we've learned about gravity might be to some extent related to the fact that, cultural distance and might matter for international as well. We also have quite an interesting heterogeneity across products. Let me conclude with this. I hope I've convinced you that trade data are multidimensional, have a lot of dimension, are fascinating. So again, come and play, go to me, and send me an email if you're interested in joining this Data Geek community.